Sometimes the deepest scars are the ones no one can see. Clara Jensen carries the weight of losing her husband to a cancer that could have been caught if someone had just looked a little closer. At 62, she spent 37 years as a nurse at St. Agnes Hospital, becoming the steady presence others depend on when life takes unexpected turns. On what starts as an ordinary Tuesday, Clara is doing a routine check on an elderly patient with dementia when she notices a small, dark spot on his cheek. Most would pass it by without a second thought, but Clara can't. Her reaction is so immediate and emotional that it stuns the entire medical staff. They don't understand why this quiet, composed nurse suddenly seems so upset over what looks like just another harmless mole. What will happen when Clara's painful past becomes the key to saving a stranger's life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of St. Agnes Hospital hummed their familiar tune as Clara Jensen made her way through the third-floor corridors at 5:30 in the morning. Her soft-soled shoes whispered against the polished linoleum, a sound that had become as natural to her as breathing over the past 37 years. At 62, Clara moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew every corner of this place, every quirk of the ancient elevator system, every doctor's coffee preference. She paused at the nurse's station, her fingers automatically reaching for the small gold chain around her neck. Hidden beneath her scrubs hung Robert's wedding ring, a simple band that had grown warm against her skin over the 5 years since his death. She tucked it back inside her uniform. A ritual, as automatic as checking a watch. Morning, Clara. Beth Martinez, 20 years younger and full of the energy that Clara remembered having once, looked up from her computer screen. You're early, even for you. Couldn't sleep. Clara's voice carried the slight rasp of someone who had been awake since 3, sitting in her kitchen with a cup of coffee that had grown cold while she stared out at the empty street. Thought I'd get a head start on the medication rounds. Beth studied her with the concerned expression of someone who had worked alongside Clara long enough to read the subtle signs. You've been having those nights again, haven't you? Clara didn't answer directly. She never did when the conversation veered toward anything too personal. Instead, she pulled up the patient assignments on her tablet, scanning the familiar names and new admissions. Mrs. Patterson in 314 is being discharged today. Her daughter's coming at 10 to take her home. Clara. And Mr. Rodriguez in 318 needs his blood pressure checked every 2 hours. Dr. Martinez wants to adjust his medication if it's still elevated. Beth sighed, recognizing the gentle deflection for what it was. Clara had perfected the art of steering conversations away from herself and toward her patients. It was one of the things that made her such an exceptional nurse, her ability to focus entirely on the people in her care. But Beth worried it came at a cost. The elevator chimed, and Dr. Elena Martinez stepped onto the floor, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her white coat crisp despite the early hour. She was the head of internal medicine, and unlike many of the younger doctors who rotated through the hospital, she had learned to value Clara's instincts. Good morning, Clara. Beth. Dr. Martinez nodded to both women as she approached the station. How did Mrs. Chen do overnight? Any changes in her breathing? Stable through the night, Clara reported, pulling up the patient's chart. Oxygen saturation remained above 95%. She was asking about when her son might visit. That's encouraging. She was pretty anxious yesterday. Dr. Martinez made a note in the chart. You have a gift for calming patients, Clara. I don't know how you do it. Clara shrugged, uncomfortable with praise as always. I just listen to them. Most people want to feel heard more than anything else. It was true, though the irony wasn't lost on her. She spent her days listening to others while carefully avoiding any conversation about herself. The patients told her about their fears, their pain, their hopes for getting back to their families. She absorbed it all, offered comfort and practical care, then went home to her quiet house where no one asked how she was doing. The morning routine unfolded as it had thousands of times before. Clara moved from room to room, checking vitals, administering medications, adjusting pillows, and offering the kind of gentle reassurance that had made her a legend among the hospital's older population. She had a way of making people feel safe, as if her presence alone could ward off the scarier aspects of being sick and vulnerable. In room 310, 84-year-old Mr. Kowalski was struggling with his breakfast tray. His arthritis made it difficult to open containers, and his pride made it difficult to ask for help. Clara stepped in without making it seem like assistance, casually opening his juice carton while asking about his grandchildren. That youngest, no, Tommy, he's playing soccer now, Mr. Kowalski said, his face lighting up as Clara helped arrange his meal. Got his first goal last weekend. That's wonderful. You must be so proud. I am. His mum, my daughter Janet, she sends me videos on that phone thing. I don't understand how it works, but I can see him running around the field. He paused, studying Clara's face. You have children, don't you, Clara? You have that way about you. The question caught her off guard, as it always did. I have a daughter. She lived nearby. Clara busied herself with checking his blood pressure cuff. Not too far. It wasn't exactly a lie. Sarah lived 40 minutes away in the suburbs. Close. Enough that they could see each other regularly if they chose to. They didn't choose to. After Robert's funeral, their relationship had fractured along lines that neither seemed able to repair. Sarah had needed to grieve differently, and Clara had needed to work. The space between them had grown until it felt unbridgeable. By mid-morning, the floor had settled into its familiar rhythm. Clara found herself in the supply closet, restocking, her cart with the items she'd need for afternoon rounds. The small, windowless space had become something of a refuge over the years, a place where she could take a moment to gather herself between the demands of one patient and the next. She was counting packages of gauze when Beth appeared in the doorway. We've got a new admission coming up from emergency. Elderly gentleman, Harold Winters, 78. Dementia symptoms. Family wants him evaluated for possible placement. Clara nodded, making mental notes about the type of approach this patient would need. Dementia patients required extra patience, gentle consistency, and an understanding that their confusion wasn't willful. Family coming with him? His daughter Margaret. She seems pretty upset about the whole situation. They usually are. It's hard to watch a parent lose themselves. Clara spoke from observation, not experience. Her own parents had died relatively young, before the slow deterioration that came with advanced age. But she'd seen enough families struggle through the decision to place a loved one in memory care to understand the guilt and heartbreak involved. The afternoon brought its usual mix of routine tasks and small emergencies. Mrs. Patterson's discharge went smoothly, her daughter tearful with gratitude for the care her mother had received. Mr. Rodriguez's blood pressure had stabilized, allowing Dr. Martinez to send him home with a new medication regimen. These small victories were what kept Clara coming back day after day. The knowledge that her work mattered, that her attention to detail and genuine care made a difference in people's lives. At 2:30, Harold Winters arrived on the floor, and Clara got her first look at the man who would change everything. He was thin and slightly stooped, with wisps of white hair and the confused expression that she'd learned to recognize in patients with dementia. His daughter Margaret walked beside the wheelchair, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. "Dad, we're going to get you settled in a nice room," Margaret was saying, her voice bright with forced cheerfulness. "The nurses here are going to take good care of you." Harold looked around with the disoriented gaze of someone trying to make sense of unfamiliar surroundings. When his eyes met Clara's, she saw a flicker of the person he had been before the disease began stealing his memories. "Hello, Mr. Winters," Clara said, crouching down to his eye level. "I'm Clara, and I'm going to be one of your nurses while you're here. We're going to make sure you're comfortable." He studied her face for a moment, then nodded slightly. "That's very kind of you." His voice was gentle, with the careful politeness of someone who had been raised to treat others with respect. Clara could see traces of the man he had been, probably. Someone who had worked with his hands, maybe raised a family, lived a life full of small daily kindnesses. "Let's get you settled in your room," Clara said, taking control of the wheelchair from the orderly who had brought Harold up from emergency. "Margaret, you can walk with us. I know this is overwhelming, but we'll take everything one step at a time." As they made their way down the hall, Margaret began the familiar litany of information that family members felt compelled to share. He was an engineer before he retired, very precise about everything. "He built our whole house himself. Every cabinet, every shelf. He's been getting confused lately, forgetting where he is, sometimes not recognizing me." Clara listened while navigating the wheelchair into room 322, the intake room they used for evaluations. It was quieter than the rooms facing the main corridor, with a window that looked out onto the hospital's small garden. She helped Harold transfer to the bed, noting his cooperation and the way he seemed to relax once he was settled. "The doctor will be in to see you soon," Clara explained to both Harold and Margaret. "But first, I need to check a few things and ask some questions. Is that all right with you, Mr. Winters?" Harold nodded, his eyes focusing on her with more clarity than she'd expected. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly. "Oh? Someone. Nice, I hope." "My wife. She was a nurse, too, during the war. She had kind eyes like yours." The comment touched Clara more than she expected. She began her routine assessment, blood pressure, temperature, pulse, while making gentle conversation. Harold answered her questions when he could, though some responses revealed the gaps in his memory. It was while she was checking his skin for any signs of breakdown or concerning marks that Clara's world stopped. On Harold's left cheek, just below his cheekbone, was a small, irregular dark spot. It was perhaps 6 millimeters across, with the slightly raised texture and uneven borders that every medical professional was trained to recognize as potentially dangerous. But for Clara, this wasn't just a clinical observation. The spot looked exactly like the one that had appeared on Robert's shoulder 3 months before his death, the one that 3 different doctors had dismissed as just a mole until it was too late. Her hand stilled on Harold's wrist where she'd been checking his pulse. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had plagued her in the months after Robert's funeral. Her breathing became shallow as the memory crashed over her. Robert pointing to the spot on his shoulder, asking if she thought it looked different, her own reassurance that it was probably nothing. "Clara?" Margaret's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Is everything all right?" Clara realized she had been staring at Harold's cheek for several seconds without moving. She forced herself to look away, to complete the pulse check, to continue with her assessment as if nothing had changed. But something fundamental had shifted. Looking at Harold's face, she saw Robert in those final weeks, the confusion, the fear, the trust in the medical professionals who had failed him. "Everything's fine," Clara managed, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "I'll just need to make some notes for the doctor." But as she helped Harold get comfortable and answered Margaret's questions about visiting hours and meal times, Clara's mind was racing. She couldn't stop looking at the spot on Harold's cheek. She couldn't stop thinking about Robert's final weeks, when the melanoma had already spread beyond any hope of treatment. After settling Harold and reassuring Margaret, Clara excused herself and walked to the nearest bathroom. She locked the door and leaned against the sink, gripping the cold porcelain until her knuckles went white. In the mirror, she saw her own reflection, a woman who had spent 5 years trying to outrun her grief through work and routine and careful emotional control. But grief, she was learning, had a way of finding you anyway, and sometimes it arrived wearing the face of a stranger who needed your help. Clara stood in the bathroom for a full minute, forcing herself to breathe slowly and deeply. The fluorescent light above the mirror flickered intermittently, casting shadows that seemed to dance across her pale face. She had dealt with difficult cases before, emotional situations that reminded her of Robert. But this felt different, more immediate, more urgent. When she returned to Harold's room, she found Dr. Reynolds reviewing the initial paperwork. At 35, Dr. Reynolds was competent but rushed, the kind of physician who moved through patients with efficiency rather than thoroughness. He was examining Harold's chart while Margaret sat in the visitor's chair, her purse clutched tightly in her lap. "Mr. Winters presents with progressive cognitive decline," Dr. Reynolds was saying to Margaret. "We'll run some standard tests, check his blood work, maybe do a brain scan to rule out any structural issues. The good news is he seems physically healthy for his age." Clara cleared her throat. "Doctor, if I could speak with you for a moment." Dr. Reynolds looked up with barely concealed impatience. "Can it wait? I have 6 more patients to see before rounds. It's about Mr. Winters. There's something I noticed during the intake. The intake notes look complete," Dr. Reynolds interrupted, scanning the tablet. "Blood pressure normal, temperature normal, no acute distress. What's the concern?" Clara felt her heart rate accelerate. This was the moment she had dreaded for 5 years, the moment when she would have to speak up the way she hadn't been able to with Robert. "There's a lesion on his left cheek. It has irregular borders and appears asymmetrical. I think it needs to be evaluated." Dr. Reynolds glanced at Harold, who was dozing lightly in the bed. "I see what you're referring to. It's just a seborrheic keratosis. Very common in elderly patients, nothing to worry about." The dismissal hit Clara like a physical blow. Those were almost the exact words Dr. Patterson had used about Robert's spot. Just a seborrheic keratosis. Nothing to worry about. She felt her hands beginning to shake. "With respect, doctor, I don't think it's a keratosis. The borders are too irregular, and the color variation." "Clara," Dr. Reynolds' voice took on the patronizing tone that she'd heard too many times over the years. "I appreciate your diligence, but I've been doing this for over 10 years. It's a benign skin lesion. Let's focus on why he's actually here. The dementia evaluation." Margaret looked between them, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. "Is there something wrong with my father's skin?" "Nothing at all," Dr. Reynolds assured her. "Nurse Jensen is just being thorough, which we appreciate, but there's no cause for concern." Clara felt the room spinning slightly. She was reliving the conversation from 5 years ago, when she had accepted Dr. Patterson's dismissal of Robert's concerns, when she had trusted the physician's expertise instead of her own instincts, when she had let politeness and hierarchy override the growing alarm in her gut. "I really think," she began again. "That's enough," Dr. Reynolds said sharply. "Unless there are any other medical concerns, I'd like to complete my evaluation." Clara stood frozen for a moment, watching Harold sleep peacefully, unaware that his life might depend on the conversation happening around him. Margaret was looking at her with a mixture of gratitude and concern. Gratitude that someone was paying attention to her father, concern about the obvious tension in the room. "Clara," Margaret said quietly, "what exactly are you seeing?" Before Dr. Reynolds could interrupt, Clara moved closer to Harold's bed. "May I show you, Mr. Winters?" she asked gently, waking him. "I want to point out something on your cheek." Harold's eyes opened, focusing on her with the same trust she'd seen earlier. "Of course, dear." Clara carefully tilted Harold's face toward the light, pointing to the spot without touching it. "This mark here, have you noticed it getting larger or darker recently?" Harold squinted, trying to see what she was indicating. "Oh, that old thing. Margaret's been after me to have someone look at it. Says it looks different than it used to." Margaret leaned forward. "Yes, I've been worried about it for months. It's definitely gotten bigger, and the shape is, well, it looks angry somehow." Dr. Reynolds sighed audibly. "These things often appear to change as patients age. The skin becomes thinner, spots become more prominent. It's completely normal." But Clara was no longer listening to Dr. Reynolds. She was looking at Margaret's face, seeing the same expression of growing alarm that she remembered from her own mirror during Robert's illness. The recognition that something wasn't right, even if the medical professionals were saying otherwise. "How long have you been concerned about it?" Clara asked Margaret. 6 months, maybe longer. I kept meaning to ask our family doctor, but Dad gets so anxious about medical appointments, and everyone said it was probably nothing. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Everyone said it was probably nothing. The same phrase that had echoed through Robert's final months, the reassurance that had cost him his life. "I think it needs to be biopsied," Clara said, her voice stronger than she felt. Dr. Reynolds closed Harold's chart with a snap. "That's not your call to make. And frankly, this kind of second-guessing is inappropriate. Mr. Winters is here for a cognitive evaluation, not a dermatology consult. But if his daughter is concerned, his daughter isn't a medical professional." Dr. Reynolds' voice was cold now. "Neither are you, technically. You're a nurse, Clara. You take vitals and give medications. You don't make diagnostic decisions." The words were designed to put her in her place, and 5 years ago they would have worked. 5 years ago, Clara would have apologized and stepped back, deferring to the doctor's authority the way she had been trained to do throughout her career. But 5 years ago, she hadn't watched Robert die from a cancer that could have been caught early. 5 years ago, she hadn't lived with the knowledge that her silence had contributed to her husband's death. "You're right," Clara said quietly. "I'm not a doctor, but I've been a nurse for 37 years, and I know what skin cancer looks like." The room fell silent. Even Harold, in his confused state, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Margaret was staring at Clara with wide eyes, and Dr. Reynolds looked genuinely shocked that a nurse had directly contradicted him in front of a patient's family. "Skin cancer," Margaret whispered. Clara felt the weight of the moment, the terrible responsibility of speaking the words that could save Harold's life or destroy her career. "I think it's possible. I think it needs to be evaluated by a dermatologist as soon as possible." Dr. Reynolds stood up abruptly. "This is completely out of line. Clara, I need to speak with you outside. Now." But before Clara could respond, Margaret stood up as well. "Wait, if there's any chance at all that it could be cancer, I want it looked at. I don't care what it takes." "Mrs. Winters," Dr. Reynolds began, "I understand your concern, but—" "No," Margaret's voice was firm. "I've already lost my mother to cancer. I'm not losing my father because we ignored something that could have been caught early." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. Margaret was fighting for her father the way Clara wished she had fought for Robert, the way she should have fought instead of trusting that others would take care of the man she loved. "I'll make the referral," Clara said, meeting Dr. Reynolds' furious gaze. "I'll call dermatology myself." "You absolutely will not," Dr. Reynolds snapped. "You're way out of bounds here, Clara. This kind of behavior will save his life," Clara finished. "Or at least give him a chance." She turned to Harold, who was watching the exchange with growing confusion. "Mr. Winters, I'm going to arrange for another doctor to look at the spot on your cheek. Is that all right with you?" Harold nodded slowly. "If you think it's important." "I do. I think it's very important." Clara looked at Dr. Reynolds one more time, seeing not just his anger, but his embarrassment at being challenged in front of a patient. She knew there would be consequences for this moment. A conversation with the head nurse, possibly a formal reprimand, maybe even disciplinary action. But as she looked at Harold's trusting face and Margaret's grateful expression, Clara realized she didn't care about the consequences. For the first time in 5 years, she was fighting for someone instead of retreating into safe silence. She was finally ready to use her voice, even if it cost her everything. That evening, Clara sat in her kitchen with Robert's medical files spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle she'd never been able to solve. The manila folder had lived in the bottom drawer of her bedroom dresser for 5 years, untouched, but never forgotten. Tonight, she'd finally pulled it out, driven by the need to understand what she'd missed, what signs she'd ignored. The pages told a story she knew by heart, but had never allowed herself to examine closely. Robert's first mention of the spot on his shoulder dismissed by their family doctor as a minor skin change. The follow-up appointment where Dr. Patterson had assured them it was nothing to worry about. The months of growing darkness and irregular borders that Robert had pointed out with increasing concern met each time with professional reassurance. Clara's hands shook as she read her own handwriting in the margins, notes she'd taken during appointments, questions she'd written down but never asked. Ask about irregular borders, mention the color changes, request biopsy. Each note had a line drawn through it, evidence of her deference to medical authority, her trust in the system that had failed them both. Her coffee had grown cold hours ago, but she couldn't bring herself to move from the table. The house felt too quiet, too empty, filled only with the ghosts of conversations she wished she'd had the courage to pursue. Robert's voice echoed in her memory. "Clara, does this look different to you? I swear it's gotten darker." She'd looked. Of course, she'd seen the changes he was talking about. But when Dr. Patterson had dismissed their concerns with such confidence, she'd let herself be convinced that her nursing background was making her overly cautious. After all, what did she know compared to a physician with decades of experience? This answer, she now understood, was quite a lot. She'd known Robert's body better than anyone. She'd seen the subtle changes, the way the spot had evolved from a simple brown mark to something more sinister. Her instincts had been correct, but her voice had been silenced by hierarchy and professional deference. Clara pulled out her laptop and began researching melanoma screening protocols. The information was readily available: criteria for suspicious lesions, guidelines for when to biopsy, statistics on survival rates when caught early versus late. Everything she read confirmed what she'd known instinctively about Harold's spot. The asymmetry, the irregular borders, the color variation, all textbook signs that warranted immediate evaluation. By midnight, she'd filled 3 pages with notes about melanoma, treatment options, and survival statistics. The research was both validating and heartbreaking. Robert's cancer could have been caught early. The treatments available when he was first concerned about the spot had excellent success rates for early-stage melanoma. Instead, by the time they'd received the correct diagnosis, the cancer had already spread to his lymph nodes and beyond. The treatment options at that point were limited and largely palliative. Robert had lived 8 months after the diagnosis, 8 months of chemotherapy and radiation that had weakened his body, while doing little to slow the disease's progression. Clara closed the laptop and gathered the medical files back into their folder. Tomorrow she would face the consequences of challenging Dr. Reynolds. She'd already left 2 messages with the dermatology department, requesting an urgent consultation for Harold. The second message had been more forceful, mentioning her concerns about potential liability if a suspicious lesion was ignored. She knew her actions would generate complaints. Dr. Reynolds would likely speak with the nursing supervisor, possibly demand disciplinary action for her insubordination. Clara had never been written up in 37 years of nursing, had never been anything but a model employee who followed protocols and deferred to physician authority. But sitting in her kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of what happened when she stayed silent, Clara realized she was prepared for whatever consequences awaited her. She'd rather face professional censure than live with another preventable death on her conscience. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Beth. "Heard about your run-in with Reynolds. You okay?" Clara stared at the message for a long moment, before typing back, "I'm fine, just trying to do the right thing. Want to talk about it?" Clara's fingers hovered over the keyboard. For 5 years, she'd deflected every attempt at deeper conversation, every offer of friendship or support. She'd kept her colleagues at arm's length, maintained professional relationships that never crossed into personal territory. "Maybe," she typed, then deleted it. "Thanks for checking on me," she wrote instead, but even that small acknowledgement felt like progress. Beth's concern was genuine, and Clara was beginning to recognize how isolated she'd become in her grief. She'd built walls around herself so high that she'd forgotten what it felt like to let people care about her. The next morning, Clara arrived. At work, 30 minutes earlier than usual, prepared for whatever confrontation awaited her. She dressed carefully, her most professional uniform, her hair neat, her manner composed. If she was going to be disciplined for advocating for a patient, she wanted to look like the competent professional she was. Beth was already at the nurse's station when Clara arrived, and her expression was concerned but supportive. "Reynolds, I filed a complaint," she said quietly. "Sandra wants to see you in her office at 8. Sandra Morrison was the head nurse, a woman Clara respected for her fair-mindedness and advocacy for her staff. If anyone would understand Clara's position, it would be Sandra." "Thanks for the heads up," Clara said, checking her patient assignments for the day. Harold was still on the list, which meant she'd have a chance to check on him before her meeting with Sandra. "Clara," Beth said, her voice hesitant, "I don't know what's going on with you lately, but whatever it is, you don't have to handle it alone." The offer of support caught Clara off guard. She looked at Beth, really looked at her, and saw genuine concern in the younger woman's eyes. "I know," Clara said softly. "Thank you. It wasn't much, but it was more openness than Clara had shown anyone in years." And as she made her way to Harold's room to check on him before her meeting, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, the possibility that she didn't have to carry her burdens entirely by herself. Harold was awake when she entered his room, and Margaret was sitting beside his bed with a cup of coffee from the hospital cafeteria. Both looked up when Clara appeared, and she saw hope mixed with anxiety in Margaret's expression. "Good morning," Clara said, her voice warm despite her own nervousness about the coming confrontation. "How did you sleep, Mr. Winters?" "Well enough," Harold replied. "Margaret says you're trying to help with this spot on my face." Clara felt her resolve strengthen. Looking at Harold's trusting expression and Margaret's grateful smile, she knew she'd made the right choice. Whatever consequences awaited her, they were worth it for the chance to save this man's life. "I am," Clara said simply. "I'm going to keep fighting for you." Sandra Morrison's office was smaller than most people expected for the head of nursing at a hospital the size of St. Agnes. The walls were covered with commendations, staff photos, and a few children's drawings that patients had given her over the years. Sandra herself was in her 50s, with greying hair and the calm demeanor of someone who had seen every possible hospital crisis and learned to handle them with grace. Clara knocked on the open door at exactly 8 o'clock. "You wanted to see me." "Come in, Clara. Close the door, please." Sandra's tone was neutral, neither accusatory nor supportive. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Dr. Reynolds spoke with me yesterday about an incident involving a patient's family. He says you undermined his medical judgment in front of the patient's daughter." Clara settled into the chair, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. "I disagreed with his assessment of a suspicious skin lesion. According to Dr. Reynolds, you diagnosed the lesion as potentially cancerous without any medical training. In dermatology, I didn't diagnose anything," Clara replied carefully. "I expressed concern about the appearance of the lesion and recommended it be evaluated by a specialist." Sandra consulted the notes on her desk. "You told the patient's daughter that you thought it could be cancer. You promised to arrange a dermatology consult without the attending physician's approval, and you did this after Dr. Reynolds explicitly told you the lesion was benign." When laid out like that, Clara's actions did sound insubordinate. She took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would determine not just her professional future, but her ability to live with herself. "Sandra, 5 years ago my husband died of melanoma that was misdiagnosed for 8 months, 3 different. Doctors told us it was nothing to worry about. By the time someone finally took it seriously, it was too late." Clara's voice remained steady, though her hands had begun to tremble slightly. "Yesterday, I saw Harold Winters with a lesion that looked exactly like my husband's. I heard his daughter expressing the same concerns I had raised about Robert, and I watched Dr. Reynolds dismiss those concerns with the same words that cost my husband his life." Sandra's expression softened slightly, though she maintained her professional demeanor. "I'm sorry about your husband, Clara. I knew you'd lost him, but I didn't realize the circumstances. I've never talked about it at work. I've tried to keep my personal life separate." Clara paused, realizing how inadequate that sounded. "But yesterday I couldn't stay silent. I couldn't watch another family go through what I went through because of medical arrogance and protocol." "You're putting me in a difficult position," Sandra said. "Dr. Reynolds is demanding disciplinary action. He says you overstepped your scope of practice and created unnecessary anxiety for the patient's family." Clara felt a flash of anger. Unnecessary anxiety. Margaret Winters has been worried about that spot for 6 months. Her anxiety isn't unnecessary, it's justified. She knows her father better than a doctor who met him 5 minutes ago. But Dr. Reynolds has medical training that apparently didn't include humility or the ability to listen to patient concerns. Clara's voice was sharper than she'd intended. She took a breath and modulated her tone. "Sandra, I've been nursing for 37 years. I've worked with hundreds of doctors, and most of them are excellent. But some of them, like Dr. Reynolds, are so convinced of their own infallibility that they can't hear what patients and families are trying to tell them." Sandra leaned back in her chair, studying Clara's face. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "I want the dermatology consult to proceed. I want Harold Winters to have the best chance at survival if that lesion is malignant, and I want to be able to advocate for my patients without fear of retaliation, even if it means challenging physician orders." Clara met Sandra's gaze directly. "Especially then, we're supposed to be patient advocates first, hospital employees second. At least, that's what I thought when I became a nurse." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Sandra had been a nurse long enough to understand the delicate balance between following orders and standing up for patients. She'd fought her own battles with physicians who saw nurses as little more than order takers. "I'll speak with Dr. Martinez about Harold Winters," Sandra said finally. "She can review the case and determine whether a dermatology consult is warranted." Clara felt a wave of relief, though she tried not to show it. Dr. Martinez was fair-minded and thorough. She would look at Harold's lesion objectively. "As for your conduct," Sandra continued, "I'm going to document this conversation and note that you were advocating for patient safety based on your professional experience. But Clara," her tone became more serious, "you can't make this a habit. If you have concerns about patient care, there are proper channels. You can't keep confronting physicians in front of families." "I understand." Clara paused, then added, "But if I see another situation where I believe a patient's life is at risk, I will speak up. I won't be silenced by hierarchy again." Sandra nodded slowly. "I respect that. Just try to handle it more diplomatically next time." As Clara left Sandra's office, she felt a strange mixture of vindication and vulnerability. She'd kept her job and potentially saved Harold's life, but she'd also exposed herself in a way that felt both terrifying and liberating. For 5 years, she'd hidden her grief behind professional competence and emotional distance. Yesterday's confrontation with Dr. Reynolds had cracked that facade, and she wasn't sure she could put it back together again. She stopped by her locker to retrieve something she'd brought from home, a small crayon drawing that Sarah had made when she was 7 years old. It showed their family of 3 standing in front of their house, all stick figures with oversized smiles. Clara had found it the night before while looking through Robert's belongings, tucked inside one of his medical journals. Looking at the drawing now, Clara felt the full weight of what she'd lost. Not just Robert, but the closeness she'd once shared with Sarah. Her daughter had tried to reach out after the funeral, but Clara had been too consumed by guilt and grief to respond appropriately. She'd pushed Sarah away at the very moment they both needed family connection most. Clara stared at the drawing for a long moment, then pulled out her phone. She scrolled to Sarah's number, her finger hovering over the call button. They hadn't spoken in 3 months, and their last conversation had been awkward and brief, a stilted exchange of pleasantries that left both of them feeling more distant than before. But if she was going to start advocating for what mattered, Clara realized, she needed to start with her own family. She took a deep breath and dialed Sarah's number, her heart pounding as the phone began to ring. Sarah's phone went straight to voicemail. Clara listened to her daughter's recorded voice, professional, distant, nothing like the animated child who had drawn the family portrait, and hung up without leaving a message. She wasn't ready for the complexity of explaining 5 years of silence in a 30-second recording. The dermatology results came back on Thursday morning. Clara was changing the IV bag for Mrs. Chen when Dr. Martinez approached, her expression grave but not unkind. Clara's hands stilled on the tubing as she read the doctor's face. "The biopsy results for Harold Winters," Dr. Martinez said quietly. "You were right, Clara. It's a malignant melanoma stage 2. If we hadn't caught it now—" She shook her head. "It would have been a very different story in 6 months." Clara felt her knees weaken. She gripped the IV pole for support, overwhelmed by a mixture of vindication and grief. She'd been right about Harold, but being right felt like a hollow victory when it came at the cost of reliving Robert's death. Will he? Clara couldn't finish the question. "The prognosis is excellent," Dr. Martinez said quickly, reading Clara's distress. "We're scheduling him for surgical excision next Tuesday. Dr. Kim, from Surgical Oncology, says the margins look clean on the biopsy, which means we likely got it before it spread. You saved his life, Clara." The words should have brought comfort, but Clara felt only the crushing weight of what could have been. Robert's life could have been saved too, if she, had been as persistent 5 years ago as she'd been this week. "I need a moment," Clara whispered. Dr. Martinez nodded. "Take all the time you need. And Clara, what you did took real courage. Not many nurses would have stood up to Reynolds like that." Clara made it to the supply closet before the tears came. She sat on the floor between the shelves of medical supplies and finally allowed herself to grieve, not just for Robert, but for all the time she'd wasted in silence, all the conversations she'd avoided, all the ways she'd failed the people she loved most. When she emerged 15 minutes later, Margaret Winters was waiting at the nurses' station. Her eyes were red from crying, but her smile was radiant. "Clara, I don't know how to thank you," Margaret said, reaching for Clara's hands. "Dr. Martinez said you insisted on the testing. She said if we'd waited even a few more months—" "I'm just glad we caught it in time," Clara managed. "My father is going to live because of you, because you refused to let them dismiss what I was seeing." Margaret's voice broke. "I kept thinking about my mother, how I wished someone had listened to me when I said she didn't seem right. With Dad, someone finally listened." Clara thought about her own daughter, about the conversations they'd never had, the support they'd never offered each other. "How is Harold handling the news?" "Better than I expected. He has his clearer moments. And during one of them, Dr. Martinez explained everything. He said—" Margaret smiled through her tears. "He said he was lucky to have an angel watching over him." That afternoon, Clara found herself in Harold's room during her break. He was sitting up in bed, looking more alert than she'd seen him since his admission. The confusion that had clouded his eyes seemed to have lifted, at least temporarily. "There's my guardian angel," he said when he saw her. "Margaret told me what you did." Clara pulled a chair close to his bed. "How are you feeling about the surgery?" "Scared," Harold admitted, "but grateful. My wife, she died of cancer, you know, breast cancer. I held her hand through all the treatments, all the doctor's appointments. I never thought I'd be the patient myself." "It's different when you're the one in the bed," Clara agreed. "Were you ever a patient? You seem to understand." Clara hesitated, then decided on honesty. "My husband had cancer, melanoma like yours, but we didn't catch it in time." Harold's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry. That must be why you recognized, why you knew to push the doctors." "I couldn't save him," Clara said quietly, "but maybe I could save you." Harold reached for her hand with fingers that trembled slightly. "Thank you for not giving up on an old man," Clara squeezed his hand gently. "Thank you for trusting me." That evening, Clara went home and climbed the stairs to her bedroom. She opened the closet that had remained largely undisturbed since Robert's death, pushing past her uniforms to reach the back corner where she'd stored his belongings. Behind the boxes of clothes she'd been meaning to donate sat an easel, a Christmas gift from Robert during their last year together. She pulled it out carefully, running her fingers over the wooden frame. Robert had noticed that she'd stopped painting after they married, too busy with work and household responsibilities to pursue her art. The easel had been his way of encouraging her to return to something that had once brought her joy. "You have too much beauty in you to keep it locked away," he'd said when she'd unwrapped it. "Promise me you'll use it." She'd promised, but then he'd gotten sick, and the easel had been forgotten in the chaos of treatments and appointments and the gradual erosion of hope. After he died, the sight of it had been too painful, a reminder of promises unkept and dreams deferred. Now Clara carried the easel downstairs and set it up in the living room, near the window where the morning light would be best. She found her old art supplies in the hall closet, brushes stiff with age, tubes of paint that would need replacing, canvases still wrapped in their original packaging. She squeezed a small amount of blue paint onto a palette and picked up a brush. Her hands remembered the motion, even after 5 years of disuse. The first stroke was tentative, then more confident. She wasn't painting anything specific, just letting the color flow across the canvas, exploring the texture and movement she'd once loved so much. For the first time in years, Clara lost track of time. She painted until the light began to fade, covering the small canvas with abstract shapes and colors that seemed to mirror her emotional state. Dark blues giving way to lighter shades, storm clouds breaking into rays of sunlight. When she finally stepped back to look at what she'd created, Clara saw her journey reflected in the brush strokes. The painting wasn't beautiful in any conventional sense, but it was honest. It was the first honest thing she'd created in 5 years. As she cleaned her brushes, Clara felt something she'd forgotten was possible, a sense of purpose that extended beyond work, beyond the careful routine she'd built to keep grief at bay. Harold would survive his cancer because she'd found the courage to speak up, and maybe, just maybe, she could find the courage to start living again too. Harold's surgery was scheduled for Tuesday morning, and Clara found herself unusually nervous as she prepared for her shift. She'd worked with surgical patients countless times, but this felt different, personal, in a way that made her hands shake slightly as she reviewed his preoperative checklist. Dr. Kim, the surgical oncologist, had explained the procedure to Harold and Margaret the previous day. It would be a wide local excision, removing the melanoma and a margin of healthy tissue around it to ensure they'd gotten all the cancerous cells. If the pathology results showed clean margins, Harold's prognosis would be excellent. Clara arrived at Harold's room at 6:30 to begin his pre-op preparation. She found him awake, staring at the ceiling with the thoughtful expression she'd learned to associate with his clearer moments. "Good morning," she said softly. "Ready for your big day?" Harold turned to look at her, and she saw determination mixed with fear in his eyes. "As ready as an old man can be, I suppose. Margaret's coming early. She wanted to be here before they take me down." Clara began checking his vital signs, noting that his blood pressure was slightly elevated, normal for someone facing surgery. "How are you feeling, really?" "Scared," Harold admitted, "but also grateful. My wife used to say that fear and gratitude could exist in the same space, and I never understood what she meant until now." Clara paused in her documentation. "Tell me about your wife." Harold's face softened. "Eleanor, she was a nurse like you. Met her during the war. I was stationed at a base hospital after I got wounded, and she was the one who took care of me. Bossy little thing, but she had the gentlest hands." He smiled at the memory. "She used to say that healing wasn't just about medicine. It was about seeing people, really seeing them when they're at their most vulnerable." "She sounds wonderful." "She." Was 43 years we had together. She died 8 years ago, and I thought I was ready to join her. But lying here now, thinking about getting another chance." Harold's voice caught. "I realize I'm not quite ready to go yet." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. Harold's words echoed her own recent awakening to the possibility that life could hold meaning again, even after devastating loss. Margaret arrived just as Clara finished Harold's pre-op checklist. She looked tired, as if she hadn't slept much, but her smile was bright as she greeted her father. "How's our patient this morning?" she asked, kissing Harold's forehead. "Nervous, but ready," Harold replied. "Clara's been taking good care of me." Margaret turned to Clara with an expression of deep gratitude. "I've been thinking all week about what might have happened if you hadn't spoken up. The doctor said another few months and—" She shook her head. "I'll never forget what you did for us." Clara felt the familiar discomfort that came with praise. The voice in her head that insisted she didn't deserve credit for finally doing what she should have done years ago. But looking at Harold's face, she tried to accept Margaret's gratitude with grace. "I'm just glad we caught it in time," Clara said. The orderlies arrived to transport Harold to surgery at 7:30. Clara walked alongside the gurney as they made their way to the elevator, Harold's hand gripping hers. "Promise me something," he said, as they reached the surgical floor. "Of course, don't stop fighting for people. What you did for me, that takes real courage. The world needs more nurses. Like you." Clara squeezed his hand gently. "I promise." As the elevator doors closed and Harold disappeared into the surgical suite, Clara felt a profound shift in her understanding of her own purpose. For 5 years, she'd been a competent nurse, going through the motions of her job. But Harold's words reminded her of why she'd become a nurse in the first place, not just to follow orders and complete tasks, but to advocate for the vulnerable, to see people when they needed to be seen most. She spent the morning anxiously checking the surgical board for updates on Harold's procedure. Dr. Kim had estimated it would take about 2 hours, but Clara found herself watching the clock obsessively, remembering her own vigil during Robert's failed surgeries. At 10:45, Dr. Kim emerged from the OR and sought out Clara at the nurse's station. His smile told her everything she needed to know before he spoke. "Clean margins," he said simply. "We got it all. Barring any complications, Mr. Winters should make a full recovery." Clara felt her knees go weak with relief. She gripped the edge of the nurse's station, overwhelmed by the realization that her voice, her refusal to stay silent, had saved Harold's life. Dr. Martinez appeared at her side. "You should be proud, Clara. What you did took real professional courage." "I should have done it years ago," Clara said quietly. "But you did it when it mattered," Dr. Martinez replied. "For Harold, for his family, that's what counts." That afternoon, Clara made a decision that surprised even her. She called the hospital's education department and volunteered to develop a skin cancer screening protocol for the nursing staff. If her experience with Harold had taught her anything, it was that nurses were often the first to notice changes in patients' conditions, but they needed to trust their observations and feel empowered to speak up. When she arrived home that evening, Clara found herself drawn back to the easel she'd set up the night before. The abstract painting from her first session looked different in the daylight, more hopeful somehow, as if the act of creating had released something she'd kept locked away. She picked up her brushes and began to work on a new canvas. This time, with more intention, the image that emerged was a landscape, rolling hills under a sky that moved from storm clouds to clear blue. It wasn't sophisticated artistically, but it represented something important: the possibility of weather changing, of darkness giving way to light. As she painted, Clara thought about the anniversary card she'd never sent to Robert. She'd found it the previous week while going through his belongings, a card she'd written for what would have been their 40th wedding anniversary, filled with words she'd never had the courage to say aloud. The card was still in her bedroom drawer, a testament to all the conversations she'd avoided, all the feelings she'd kept buried. But looking at her painting now, Clara realized that avoiding her grief hadn't made it disappear. It had simply prevented her from processing it, from finding a way to carry her love for Robert forward instead of letting it weigh her down. She set down her brush and went upstairs to retrieve the card. It was time to face the words she'd written, to honor both her grief and her love, and to finally begin the work of healing that she'd postponed for too long. Clara sat on her bed with the anniversary card in her hands, its envelope yellowed with age. She'd written it 3 years ago, on what would have been their 40th wedding anniversary, but had never found the courage to visit Robert's grave. To read it aloud, the card had remained in her drawer, a symbol of all the words left unsaid. She opened it carefully, her own handwriting blurred by tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed at the time. My dearest Robert, today would have been 40 years since we promised to love each other in sickness and in health. I failed you in the sickness part. I should have fought harder, should have demanded second opinions, should have trusted my instincts over their authority. I carry that guilt every day, along with missing your laugh, your terrible jokes, the way you hummed while making coffee. I don't know how to forgive myself, but I know you would want me to try. I love you still, and always, Clara. Reading the words now, Clara felt the familiar ache of loss, but also something unexpected, a recognition that grief and love weren't the same thing. She'd been carrying Robert's love like a burden instead of a gift, using it to punish herself, rather than to honor his memory. She was folding the card back into its envelope when she noticed something she'd missed before, a small piece of paper that had been tucked behind the card. With trembling fingers, she unfolded what appeared to be a letter, written in handwriting she recognized but hadn't seen in 5 years. It was from Sarah. Mum, I've started this letter a dozen times since Dad's funeral, but I never know what to say. I know you're hurting, and I know you blame yourself for what happened with his diagnosis, but I need you to know that Sarah's not your fault. Dad wouldn't want you to carry that guilt. I've been wanting to call, wanting to visit, but every time we talk, it feels like we're both drowning in what we can't say to each other. I became a social worker because of what we went through with Dad, because I saw how the system failed how it failed our family. I want to help other families navigate what we couldn't. I hope someday we can talk about this, really talk, without all the careful politeness that's grown between us. I miss my mom. I miss the woman who used to paint landscapes and laugh at Dad's horrible puns and make everything feel safe. I know she's still in there somewhere. Love, Sarah. P.S. I found this card you wrote to Dad and wanted you to know that forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness, isn't selfish. It's necessary. Clara stared at the letter, her hands shaking. Sarah must have found the anniversary card when she'd helped Clara clean out Robert's study after the funeral, but Clara had been so lost in her grief that she'd never seen her daughter. Slipped the letter into the envelope. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. For 5 years, she'd assumed Sarah had pulled away because she blamed Clara for Robert's death, because she couldn't bear to be around the mother who had failed to save her father. But Sarah's letter revealed a completely different truth. Her daughter had been grieving too, trying to find her own way to honor Robert's memory, waiting for Clara to surface from her guilt long enough to reconnect. Clara reached for her phone with trembling hands and dialed Sarah's number. This time she wouldn't hang up if it went to voicemail. This time she would find the words. "Mom?" Sarah's voice was surprised but warm. "Is everything okay?" "I found your letter," Clara said, her voice breaking. "The one you put with my anniversary. And card to Dad." There was a long pause, then Sarah's intake of breath. "I wondered if you'd ever see that. I wasn't sure. I didn't know if you ever looked at the card again." "I was afraid to," Clara admitted, "just like I've been afraid to call you, afraid to face how badly I've handled everything since Dad died." "Mom, you didn't handle it badly. You handled it the only way you could." Clara felt tears streaming down her face. "I pushed you away when we both needed each other. I let my guilt become more important than my love for you. We both made mistakes, Sarah said softly. I should have tried harder to reach you. I should have insisted we talk instead of giving you space you didn't really need. I read about your work, Clara said. Social work, helping families dealing with medical crises. Sarah, I'm so proud of you. Dad would be so proud. I learned it from watching you, Mom. Even when you thought you were failing Dad, you were still advocating for him, still fighting for the best care possible. You just weren't fighting for yourself. Clara closed her eyes, feeling something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of guilt she'd carried for so long. I saved a patient's life this week, a man with melanoma. I recognized the signs that doctors were dismissing, and I refused to stay quiet. That's wonderful, Mom. That's exactly what Dad would have wanted, for his experience to help save someone else. I keep thinking about what might have been different if I'd spoken up more forcefully for Dad. But you did speak up, Sarah said firmly. I remember those appointments, Mom. You asked questions, you pushed for tests, you advocated for him every way you knew how. The system failed Dad, not you. Clara felt a sob escape her throat. I miss him so much. And I miss you. I miss the relationship we used to have before I let grief build walls between us. I miss that too, Sarah said, her own voice thick with emotion. But we can build something new, can't we? We can honor Dad's memory by taking care of each other instead of carrying guilt that doesn't belong to us. I want that, Clara whispered. I want my daughter back. I'm right here, Mom. I've been waiting for you to come back to us. They talked for another hour, filling in the gaps of 5 years, sharing memories of Robert that brought laughter instead of pain, making plans to see each other the following weekend. When Clara finally hung up, she felt lighter than she had in years, as if Sarah's forgiveness had given her permission to begin forgiving herself. She looked at the anniversary card again, reading her words with new understanding. The guilt she'd been carrying wasn't love, it was fear. Fear that letting go of the pain would mean letting go of Robert, that healing would somehow dishonor his memory. But Sarah was right. Forgiveness wasn't selfish, it was necessary. And Clara was finally ready to begin the work of healing that she'd postponed for too long. She walked to her bedroom window and looked out at the garden Robert had planted during their last spring together. The roses he'd chosen were blooming despite years of neglect, their hardy roots having survived even when she'd stopped tending them. Like love, Clara realized. Like family. Like the possibility of joy even after devastating loss. She went downstairs to her easel and began a new painting, not abstract this time, but realistic. She painted Robert's roses in full bloom, their petals open to sunlight, their stems strong despite the storms they'd weathered. It was her first step toward carrying his love forward, instead of carrying it as a burden. And for the first time, in 5 years, Clara allowed herself to believe that healing was possible, that she could honor Robert's memory by choosing to live fully instead of existing in the shadow of her grief. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn light that Robert had always loved for painting. Clara stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting her sweater for the 3rd time, nervous in a way she hadn't felt in years. Sarah was driving up from the suburbs to visit, their first face-to-face meeting since a stilted lunch 2 years ago that had left both of them feeling more distant than before. This time would be different. It had to be. Clara had spent the week preparing, not just cleaning the house, but emotionally readying herself for conversations she'd avoided for too long. She'd also been working on the melanoma screening protocol she'd volunteered to develop, throwing herself into research with the same intensity she'd once brought to her art. The project had given her a sense of purpose beyond her daily nursing duties, a way to channel her experience with Robert's misdiagnosis into something that could help others. Dr. Martinez had been enthusiastic about the initiative, and word had spread through the hospital about Clara's role in saving Harold's life. Several younger nurses had approached her for advice about advocating for patients when physicians seemed dismissive. Clara found herself becoming an unexpected mentor, teaching others to trust their clinical instincts the way she'd finally learned to trust her own. But despite these professional victories, Clara's stomach fluttered with anxiety as she watched for Sarah's car from the living room window. 5 years of careful emotional distance couldn't be bridged in a single phone conversation, no matter how healing it had been. They would need to relearn how to be mother and daughter, how to navigate their shared grief without the protective barriers they'd both constructed. At 10:30, a blue Honda pulled into Clara's driveway. Clara's breath caught as she watched Sarah get out. She looked so much like Robert, with his dark hair and thoughtful expression. But she had Clara's eyes, and when she looked up at the house, Clara saw her own mixture of hope and nervousness, reflected in her daughter's face. Clara opened the front door before Sarah could knock, and for a moment they stood looking at each other across the threshold. Sarah was 34 now, a grown woman with laugh lines around her eyes and the confident posture of someone who'd found her calling in life. But standing there with her purse clutched in both hands, she looked like the uncertain little girl she'd once been. "Hi, Mom," Sarah said softly. "Hi, sweetheart." They embraced on the front porch, tentatively at first, then with increasing warmth as the familiar comfort of being mother and daughter reasserted itself. Clara felt tears threatening and blinked them back. There would be time for crying later, but right now she wanted to focus on the miracle of having Sarah in her arms again. "Come in," Clara said, stepping back to let Sarah enter. "I made coffee, the good kind you like." Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her face. "You remembered." "I remember everything about you," Clara said. "I just lost track of how to—" "Say it." They settled in the living room, coffee cups providing something to do with their hands as they navigated the delicate terrain of reconnection. Sarah's eyes went immediately to the easel by the window, where Clara's painting of Robert's roses was nearly complete. "Mom, you're painting again," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. "It's beautiful." Clara looked at the canvas, seeing it through Sarah's eyes. It felt strange at first, picking up a brush again, like I was betraying something by finding joy in it. "Dad would be so happy to see you creating again. He always said your art was one of the things that made you most yourself." "I'd forgotten that part of myself existed," Clara admitted. "Work became my whole identity after he died. Safer that way. No room for anything that might hurt." Sarah set down her coffee cup and leaned forward. "Tell me about the patient you saved, the one with melanoma." Clara found herself sharing the story of Harold Winters, the initial dismissal by Dr. Reynolds, her moment of recognition and panic, the decision to fight for proper evaluation despite professional consequences. As she talked, Sarah's expression grew more and more proud. "That's incredible, Mom. You literally saved his life because you refused to let history repeat itself." "It felt terrifying," Clara said. "Standing up to that doctor, knowing I could be disciplined or worse. But I kept thinking about your father, about all the things I wished I'd said during his treatment." "You know what I think," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm. "I think Dad was working through you that day. All the love you felt for him, all the regret, it became courage when someone else needed it." Clara felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of self-recrimination that had been wound tight for 5 years. "I've been so angry at myself for not fighting harder for him." "But you did fight, Mom. Maybe not in the dramatic way you fought for Mr. Winters, but you were there for every appointment, every treatment, every difficult conversation. You held his hand through everything." They talked through lunch, sharing memories that had been too painful to voice alone. Sarah told Clara about her work with families dealing with medical crises, how she'd channeled her own experience of navigating the healthcare system into advocacy for others. Clara shared stories from the hospital, including her growing role as a mentor to younger nurses who were learning to find their voices in challenging situations. "I want to show you something," Clara said, getting up to retrieve a folder from the kitchen counter. "I've been working on a screening protocol for melanoma and other skin cancers, something to help nurses identify suspicious lesions and feel empowered to advocate for proper evaluation." Sarah examined the documents with the professional eye of someone who understood healthcare systems. "This is thorough, Mom, and it's needed. I see families all the time who fall through the cracks because nobody wants to challenge medical authority. Dr. Martinez thinks it could be implemented hospital-wide, maybe even shared with other facilities. The administration is surprisingly supportive. That's Dad's legacy," Sarah said firmly. "His struggle is going to help save other people's fathers, other people's husbands." Clara felt tears finally spill over. "I miss him so much, Sarah. I miss talking to him about my day, missing having someone who understood why certain patients touched my heart, miss having him encourage me to keep painting even when I felt too tired or discouraged." "I miss him too," Sarah said, reaching across the table to take Clara's hand. "But Mom, you don't have to carry that missing alone anymore. I want to hear about your patients. I want to see your paintings. I want to be the family you still have." "I've been so afraid," Clara whispered. "Afraid that if I stopped hurting so much, I'd somehow lose the connection to him. As if the pain was proof of how much I loved him." "Love doesn't require pain," Sarah said. "Dad wouldn't want you to suffer. As a testament to how much you cared. He'd want you to live, to create, to help people the way you helped Mr. Winters." That afternoon, Sarah helped Clara go through more of Robert's belongings, not to purge them, but to decide what to keep visible as loving reminders rather than painful ghosts. They found photo albums, letters, small mementos that told the story of 40 years together. Instead of putting everything away, they created a small memorial space in the living room where Clara could see reminders of their life together without being overwhelmed by loss. "I have something for you," Sarah said as they worked. She pulled out a small wrapped package from her purse. "I've been carrying this around for 2 years, waiting for the right moment to give it to you." Clara unwrapped the gift to find a small silver frame containing a photo she'd never seen before. Robert and Clara at Sarah's college graduation, their arms around each other, their faces glowing with pride. Someone had captured them in a moment of pure joy, and looking at it now, Clara could remember exactly how happy they'd been that day. "Where did you find this?" "Dad had it on his desk at work. His secretary gave it to me after the funeral. But I wasn't sure you were ready to see it. You both look so in love, so happy." Clara traced the glass with her finger, studying Robert's face. He looked healthy in the photo, vibrant, full of the optimism that had characterized their early years together. "We were happy," she said softly. "Even with all the struggles, even knowing how it ended, we were really happy." "That's what I want you to remember," Sarah said. "Not the fear and the medical appointments and the things that went wrong. The love, the laughter, the 40 years of choosing each other every day." As evening approached, Sarah prepared to drive back to her own home, but the goodbye felt different this time. Not like an ending, but like a beginning. They made plans for regular dinners, for Sarah to meet Clara's colleagues, for Clara to see Sarah's apartment and meet her friends. "Thank you," Clara said, as they hugged goodbye on the front porch. "For not giving up on us, for waiting for me to find my way back." "Thank you for being brave enough to save Mr. Winters," Sarah replied, "and for being brave enough to save us too." As Sarah's car disappeared down the street, Clara stood in her doorway, feeling something she'd forgotten was possible. Anticipation for the future. She had work she cared about, art that brought her joy, and a daughter who wanted to be part of her life again. For the first time in 5 years, Clara Jensen was ready to stop merely surviving and start living again. Monday morning brought news that transformed Clara's personal breakthrough into something larger. Dr. Martinez found her at the nurses' station during morning rounds, her expression a mixture of excitement and professional pride. "Clara, I just got off the phone with the medical board," Dr. Martinez said. "They want to review your melanoma screening protocol for potential adoption across the entire hospital system." Clara looked up from her patient charts, not quite processing the magnitude of what she was hearing. The entire system? 6 hospitals, Clara. Over 3,000 nurses. Your protocol could become the standard of care for skin cancer screening in our region." Dr. Martinez paused, her expression growing more serious. "They also want you to present it at next month's nursing conference. It's a big deal. Nurses and doctors from across the state will be there." The thought of presenting her work to hundreds of medical professionals should have been terrifying, but Clara found herself nodding. If it helps prevent what happened to Robert, what almost happened to Harold, then I'll do whatever they need. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez continued. "Harold Winters wants to see you. He's been asking for you specifically since he woke up from surgery." Clara made her way to Harold's room, where she found him sitting up in bed looking remarkably alert for someone who'd undergone major surgery just days earlier. Margaret was beside him, and both their faces lit up when Clara appeared. "There she is," Harold said, his voice stronger than she'd heard it since his admission. "My guardian angel." "How are you feeling?" Clara asked, automatically checking the surgical site, which was healing beautifully. "Like I've been given a second chance," Harold replied. "The pathology results came back this morning. Clean margins, no spread to nearby tissue. Dr. Kim says I have every reason to expect a full recovery." Clara felt a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly knocked her down. This was what victory looked like. Not just the successful surgery, but the moment when a patient realized they would live, would have more time with their family, would see another Christmas. "I'm so glad," Clara managed, her voice thick with emotion. Margaret stood up and embraced Clara warmly. "I've been telling everyone about what you did, how you refused to let the doctors dismiss what I was seeing. You gave my father his life back." "I just did what any nurse should do," Clara said. "No," Harold interrupted firmly. "What you did took courage. It took someone willing to risk their own position to fight for a patient. Margaret told me you stood up to that doctor, insisted on testing even when he said it wasn't necessary." Clara thought about Dr. Reynolds, who had been notably cooler toward her since Harold's diagnosis had proven her right. There had been no apology, no acknowledgement that his dismissive attitude could have cost a man his life. But there had also been no formal reprimand, and Clara had noticed that he was more willing to listen to nursing concerns in recent days. "Can I tell you something?" Harold asked, his voice growing thoughtful. "Yesterday, when I was sitting here thinking about getting to live longer, I realized something important. My Eleanor always said that we're not here just for ourselves. We're here to take care of each other. What you did for me, that's what she meant." Clara felt tears threatening again. "Your wife sounds like a wise woman." "She was, and she would have loved you." Harold reached for Clara's hand. "I want to do something to make sure other people get the same chance you gave me." Margaret leaned forward. "Dad and I have been talking. We want to establish a fund for skin cancer awareness and early detection. We want to make sure other families know what to look for, know how to advocate for proper care." Clara stared at them, overwhelmed by the idea that her moment of courage was rippling outward in ways she'd never imagined. "That's wonderful, but we want you to be involved," Harold continued, "to help us develop educational materials, maybe work with other hospitals to implement screening programs. Your protocol that Dr. Martinez mentioned, that could be just the beginning." Clara thought about Robert, about all the ways his death had felt senseless and preventable, the possibility that his experience could become the foundation for saving. Other lives felt like a kind of redemption she'd never dared to hope for. "I would be honored," Clara said quietly. As she left Harold's room, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years, a sense of purpose that extended beyond her daily duties, beyond the careful routine she'd built to manage her grief. She was becoming part of something larger than herself, something that could transform her loss into a legacy of life-saving advocacy. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Thinking about you today. Proud of the difference you're making. Dad would be so proud too." Clara smiled, typing back, "Just getting started. Can't wait to tell you about the latest developments." For the first time since Robert's death, Clara felt truly alive, not just surviving from day to day, but engaged in work that mattered, connected to people who cared about her, and ready to honor her husband's memory by fighting for others the way she wished she'd fought for him. 3 weeks later, Clara stood in the conference center auditorium, looking out at 200 healthcare professionals who had gathered to hear her present the Harold Winters melanoma screening protocol, named, at Harold's insistence, to honor the patient whose case had sparked its development. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged her notes, but the nervousness was different from the paralyzing fear she'd once felt. This was the good kind of nervous, the kind that came with doing something important. Sarah sat in the third row, having taken time off work to attend her mother's presentation. Next to her sat Harold and Margaret, both beaming with pride. Even Dr. Martinez had come, despite having heard Clara practice the presentation multiple times. 5 years ago, Clara began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone. My husband died of melanoma that went undiagnosed for 8 months. 3 different physicians assured us that the spot on his shoulder was nothing to worry about. By the time someone finally took our concerns seriously, it was too late. The auditorium was completely silent. 200 medical professionals, listening to a nurse speak truth about the system they all worked within. I spent 5 years believing I had failed him, that I hadn't advocated strongly enough, hadn't pushed hard enough for proper evaluation. I carried that guilt like a burden until the day I met Harold Winters, a patient whose suspicious lesion was being dismissed by the attending physician in almost identical language to what my husband had heard. Clara clicked to the first slide, showing before and after photos of Harold's lesion. This time, I refused to stay silent. I challenged the physician's assessment in front of the patient's family. I insisted on a dermatology consult despite being told it was unnecessary. That decision saved Mr. Winters' life. She saw nods throughout the audience, recognition in the faces of nurses who had faced similar moments of doubt, similar pressure to defer to physician authority even when their instincts screamed otherwise. The protocol we're presenting today isn't just about identifying suspicious lesions, Clara continued. It's about empowering nurses to trust their clinical observations, to advocate for their patients even when that advocacy feels uncomfortable or professionally risky. For the next 30 minutes, Clara walked through the screening criteria, the documentation process, and the communication strategies that made up her protocol. She shared statistics on early detection survival rates, case studies from the pilot program at St. Agnes, and testimonials from nurses who had successfully advocated for patients using the new guidelines. But the heart of her presentation was the story. Harold's story, Robert's story, and the countless other patients whose lives hung in the balance of whether healthcare providers would listen to concerns and trust clinical instincts over hierarchical deference. When she finished, the applause was immediate and sustained. Clara saw tears in several faces in the audience, recognition of the personal cost behind the professional presentation. During the question and answer session, nurse after nurse shared similar experiences. Patients whose concerns were dismissed, family members whose advocacy was discounted, and their own struggles to find the courage to challenge physician authority when patient safety was at stake. What advice would you give to a nurse who recognizes a potential problem but feels afraid to speak up? Asked a young woman in the back row. Clara thought of herself 5 years ago, of all the appointments where she'd bitten her tongue, of all the questions she'd written down but never asked. Remember that patient advocacy is at the core of nursing, she said. We're not just order takers or task completers. We're often the healthcare providers who spend the most time with patients, who see the subtle changes, who hear the concerns that get lost in 5-minute physician encounters. Our voices matter, and our patients' lives may depend on our willingness to use them. After the presentation, Clara was surrounded by colleagues wanting to share their own stories, to ask for guidance, implementing similar protocols, to express Gratitude for someone finally saying what they'd all been thinking. Dr. Patricia Wells, the chief nursing officer for the State Medical Association, approached Clara with an unexpected proposal. "We'd like to offer you a position developing patient advocacy training programs," Dr. Wells said. "It would involve traveling to hospitals throughout the state, teaching nurses how to implement protocols like yours, helping them find their voices in challenging situations." Clara felt a flutter of excitement mixed with uncertainty. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure I'm ready to leave St. Agnes. My patients there." "You'd still maintain a clinical position," Dr. Wells assured her. "This would be additional work, but it could help transform nursing practice across the entire state. Think about how many more Harold Winters you could help save." That evening, Clara sat in her living room with Sarah, Harold, and Margaret, celebrating the success of the presentation over takeout Chinese food. The formal setting seemed wrong somehow. This felt like a family dinner, these people who had become so important to her recovery and growth. "I'm proud of you, Mom," Sarah said, raising her water glass in a toast. "Dad would be so proud too. You turned his loss into something that's going to save lives." Harold raised his own glass, his eyes bright with emotion. "To Clara Jensen, who gave me back my life and is giving hope to countless families who don't even know her name yet." Clara felt the weight of the moment, the recognition that this was what healing looked like. Not the absence of grief, but the transformation of loss into purpose, of pain into advocacy, of silence into a voice that could save lives. She was finally ready to step fully into the life that waited beyond her grief. 6 months later, Clara stood in her backyard garden, her hands deep in the rich spring soil as she planted new rose bushes alongside the ones Robert had chosen during their final spring together. The old roses had survived the years of neglect, their roots strong enough to endure even when she'd forgotten to tend them. Now she was adding to his legacy: yellow roses for friendship, white ones for new beginnings, pink ones for gratitude. Sarah knelt beside her, helping to position the new plants with the same careful attention Robert had shown when he'd first planned this space. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that had taken months to rediscover, but now felt natural again. Mother and daughter sharing a task, sharing presence, sharing the gentle work of making something beautiful. "I got the letter from the medical board yesterday," Clara said, sitting back on her heels to admire their work. "The Harold Winters Protocol is now required training for all nurses in the state system. 3 other states are implementing pilot programs." Sarah smiled, her hands still busy with the soil around a particularly delicate white rose. "How many hospitals is that now?" 47 so far, with more requesting information every week." Clara shook her head, still amazed by the reach of something that had started with one moment of courage in Harold's hospital room. "Dr. Wells thinks we could have national implementation within 2 years. "Dad's legacy," Sarah said simply. Clara nodded, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that came with missing Robert, but without the crushing weight of guilt that had once accompanied every memory. "I wish he could see it. Wish he could know that his struggle meant something." "He knows," Sarah said with quiet certainty. "I believe that completely." They finished planting as the afternoon sun slanted across the garden, creating the kind of golden light that Robert had always insisted made everything look like a painting. When they were done, Clara stood and brushed the soil from her hands, surveying their work with satisfaction. The garden looked alive again. Not a shrine to what was lost, but a celebration of what continued to grow. "Harold's coming for dinner tonight," Clara said as they gathered their tools. "And Beth from work, and her husband. You'll like them." "I'm looking forward to it," Sarah replied. "I love seeing you surrounded by people who care about you." It was true. Clara's house was no longer the quiet, empty space it had been for 5 years. Sarah came for dinner twice a week, bringing stories from her social work practice and questions about Clara's latest training seminars. Harold visited regularly, their friendship deepening as his recovery progressed and his skin cancer advocacy work expanded. Even her relationships with colleagues had changed, with Clara finding herself sought out for advice, for mentorship, for the kind of professional support she'd once been too isolated to offer or receive. That evening, Clara's dining room filled with laughter and conversation, as 6 people who had become family in various ways shared a meal around the table where she'd once sat alone with Robert's medical files. Harold regaled them with stories from his latest fundraising efforts, while Beth updated everyone on the newest nurses who were implementing the screening protocol at St. Agnes. "I had a young nurse approach me yesterday," Beth said, passing the salad to Harold's left. "She said she'd identified 2 suspicious lesions in the past month, using Clara's guidelines. Both patients are getting proper treatment now because she felt empowered to speak up." Clara felt the familiar warmth that came with such reports, the knowledge that her voice, once silenced by grief and professional deference, was now multiplying into hundreds of other voices advocating for patient safety. After dinner, Harold pulled Clara aside in the kitchen while the others lingered around the table. His recovery had been remarkable, not just physically, but emotionally. The man who had arrived at the hospital confused and frightened was now vibrant, purposeful, committed to ensuring other families wouldn't face the terror of late-stage cancer diagnosis. "I have something for you," he said, pulling a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. "Margaret and I wanted you to have this." Clara unwrapped the gift to find a silver locket, delicately engraved with a pattern of roses. Inside was a tiny photograph, Harold and Eleanor on their wedding day, young and radiant with hope. "Eleanor wore this for 43 years, Harold said softly. "She believed that love doesn't end with death. It just changes form, becomes something we carry forward. I want you to have it, to remember that the love you carry for Robert has saved my life and will save others." Clara felt tears spill over as she fastened the locket around her neck, where it joined Robert's wedding ring on its chain. 2 symbols of enduring love, worn close to her heart as reminders that grief and joy could coexist, that honoring the dead meant fully embracing life. Later, after everyone had gone home and Sarah had returned to her apartment, Clara sat at her easel in the living room, working on her latest painting, a landscape of rolling hills under a sky full of stars. Her technique had improved over the months of regular practice, but more importantly, her willingness to create had returned. She painted not to escape or to remember, but simply because beauty deserved to be captured, shared, celebrated. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Wells. "Chicago wants you for their October conference. 2,000 nurses. Are you ready?" Clara looked around her living room, at Robert's photograph smiling from the memorial space she and Sarah had created, at Harold's roses blooming outside her window, at the easel that held her latest attempt to capture light and hope on canvas. She thought about the protocol that would soon protect patients across multiple states, about the young nurses who were finding their voices because she'd finally found hers, about the family she'd rebuilt from love and loss and unexpected friendships. She typed back, "I'm ready." And for the first time in 6 years, Clara Jensen meant it completely. She was ready for whatever came next, secure in the knowledge that love, for Robert, for Sarah, for patients she'd never met but was determined to protect, had finally taught her how to live again.